Welcome to Connect and Collaborate. I'm Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and we are ready for episode 2 of Redefining Rural, which is brought to you by CSU Global. So I am excited to have in studio with me Michelle Murphy, Kirk Banghart, Denille, LePlatt, and their guest, Elaine Belansky. She is the director for the Center of Rural School Health and Education, or CRUSH, better known as. So we are going to get this conversation started. Very excited to do so.
Well, thanks, Elaine, for being here. We're so excited to have you join in this conversation today. And we know from the work that we've been doing in the field for the past few years that mental health is really a priority for all of our districts across the state, and especially rural. So if you'd like to get us started by talking about the center, the work that you've been doing, and then we'll talk about some of the statistics and how we know that this is a priority for our districts.
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me. So I am at the University of Denver in the Morgridge College of Education, and it's very exciting because a year ago we set up a brand new center called the Center for Rural School Health and Education, and our vision is healthy, happy children living in vibrant rural communities. And part of the reason why I wanted to be situated in the Morgridge College of Education is because increasingly, really since like 2014, the various rural school districts that we partner with were telling us mental health in terms of their biggest concern. And the beauty of being situated at DU is that even just within Morgridge, we have counseling psychology, we've got school psychology, we've got child and family, and then across the street, we've got the Graduate School of Social Work, and then down the campus a little bit, we've got the Graduate School of Professional Psychology. So we have a lot of resources to help meet some of the mental health needs that the rural school districts are telling us about.
Great. We're so excited to talk about some of the incredible work that you're doing in the field. But first, can you help us set up for the listeners what does the data pick, right? We all collect data, report data. What does the data picture look like statewide and for rural schools in particular around mental health?
Sure. So the state of Colorado has sadly consistently been in the top 10 states in the country in terms of having high suicide rates. And when you look at a map of Colorado, what you see is that those rates are much higher in rural communities than they are in the suburban and urban districts. And, you know, the state does a good job trying to collect data to describe that further. And so, like, among young people, among middle and high school kids, for example, we know that about 30% of students are telling us that they have felt sad or hopeless in the past 14 days. Girls report that at a much higher level than boys. And in fact, and that pattern exists even in suicide attempts, that girls are attempting at much higher rates than boys, but boys are completing at higher rates than girls. And then one other thing that I think is really important to point out is that this issue is even more pronounced among the LGBTQ community. The rates are unbelievably high, 45% of kids reporting having considered suicide. So there's a real issue.
Thank you. Talk a little bit, too. I think Denille and Kirk and I, one of the things that sort of tugs at our heartstrings in the urgency in this is that we know that students around the state have increasing mental health needs, and that educators around the state have difficulty meeting those needs, even understanding what it's going to take to get the students and the families, because we can't leave the families out of this conversation, the supports that they need. But in rural communities, we have almost impossible. We talk about the teacher shortage, and we talked about that during our last podcast. A shortage of mental health workers, behavioral health workers. Talk about who those people are, what those positions may be, and what that looks like for rural. And Denille and Kirk, chime in terms of specific circumstances you all have seen.
Well, yeah, and I think along with that, some of the other risk factors that we see in our communities might be important to touch on. So some of the additional challenges that are an additional layer of challenges for our rural communities might be important to talk about to kind of set the stage and leading up to our educator shortage or special service provider shortage and how that all fits together. Because I think in the broad conversation of all of this, so much of this overlaps. So one thing leads to another. We all fall under this umbrella. There's lots of different moving pieces, and I think that's important for people to understand as well.
So I'll do the workforce shortage, and then maybe we can talk about those risk factors.
I have to say that Elaine
Right.
said, just ask me one question at a time. And we just jammed her with two. So we're just testing you, but way to reel us back in.
I'm flexible. So another striking map to look at is a map of the workforce, the mental health workforce shortage areas in the state of Colorado. So if you can imagine the square, basically, of Colorado, every single county is a mental health shortage area with the exception of the Denver metro area, like going up to Boulder and Larimer County. But other than that, every single county in our state does not have adequate numbers of mental health professionals.
Can you talk about who those professionals are?
Yeah, I was going to. So in the school setting, there's probably at least 3 people, but maybe even because of the unique circumstances of a rural community, we could even maybe talk about the possibility of a 4th type of person. So in schools, there's the school psychologist. That person has the ability to do testing, psychological testing, as well as provide, what I would call primary prevention services all the way up to tertiary. And by that I mean the school psychologist in their job roles, they ideally are operating at all levels of the multi-tiered systems of support. So like school-wide initiatives to promote mental health, as well as the second tier of helping children who are already struggling with mental health issues, and then the third tier really working very directly with children already having pretty severe challenges. So that's the school psychologist. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's important to mention too that the school psychologists are being shared among districts because they're
Right.
BOCES employees. So it's not like a school in a rural setting is going to have their own psychologist, but that psychologist is going to be working in multiple settings across many of the districts within that BOCES region.
Right, some days driving, upwards of 20, 40 miles a day to get
Even
to more than that,
Oh yeah,
right?
even like 170 miles. Yeah.
And I think we see in our work is that those folks, unfortunately, may only, depending on where they are in the state, may only get back to a school or to be able to work with a particular child once a week or once every
Right,
other week.
right.
And so, though they have a lot of abilities and can really help kids, one of the issues that we really face is actually getting them time to work with kids and be there due to distance and travel and then separation from their sites that they work with.
Yeah, that's such an important point because there's not that consistent frequency.
The relationship
Right,
for the action
right.
to help
Yeah.
the kiddo.
Yeah.
Well, and the relationship among the staff as well. And I think that's one of the pain points that exists is that when you're not in a building consistently, then you can't have those strong relationships with a lot of that staff, which might create some isolation for that person.
Right. So then there's also the school counselor. And my understanding, and you should correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the school counselor is embedded in the school district. So like as opposed to the sort of that traveling doctor, that you just described, the traveling school psychologist, the school counselor is fairly embedded, I would say. Is that what you would say, Kirk?
Where they have them.
Yeah.
I mean, I think most
yeah.
of our high schools have them for college planning, right? But not all of our elementary schools have sort of a counselor in a social emotional role.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we see when we talk to parents and community is that there's an assumption that role is that all they're doing is working with kids directly on their concerns. And I think, as you brought up, one of the things that we see is that role has changed over time, and a lot of the work that we see our counselors doing, unfortunately, may not be in the behavioral health realm, but it's also around things like post-secondary readiness, helping them get ready for college to be able to do applications. Also, scheduling for our small districts is another role that our counselors fill in a lot of, and so I think they get pulled away from direct services to kids. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we know we see with our counselors when they have a counselor. So I think, as Michelle pointed out, that some of our districts do not have counselors in them, depending on their ability to recruit and get or be able to afford to have them within their building to focus on those issues that need to happen.
Well, and I think, too, it goes back to that capacity issue. Everyone's serving multiple roles and responsibilities. A lot of them are serving as district assessment coordinators and doing all of the assessment scheduling and planning for their schools and districts. And so they're just pulled in a variety of directions, and then it's difficult to find that balance to actually work with kids. So, yes, they're embedded, but they're embedded in a lot of different ways, serving in a lot of different roles.
Yeah, and I think this is such an important conversation, because when you look at some of those data points we were talking about earlier, where 30% of kids are reporting feeling sad or hopeless in the past 2 weeks. And I think I can look at my numbers here, but I think it's 17% of kids saying that they've had suicidal ideation. It just brings home the point of how important it is to have those mental health services in place. So I'll just finish with the third type of person in a school building is a social worker. And, my understanding from some of the partnerships we have in Southeast Colorado, that model is not even in place. I don't know from your own experience if you're seeing it in other parts of the state.
Yeah, I think what I see with our membership is that a lot of folks do not access social workers as it. I think the reasons for that may be multiple. One's always financial. The other is that there seems to be a stigma around that title. And so that's one of the things that I think we see is the skill set that a social worker brings to a school district is hugely vital, but it's not necessarily seen or heard in the respect. I think it's been dramatized by media and those things as a different role than we actually know that it could provide for kids.
I think that's part of the challenge, particularly in our rural communities and at the State House, quite honestly, is changing this conversation from one about psychological health or mental health, and I think we call it behavioral health, to sort of soften it and broaden the definition about these are not for individuals who are broken or crazy, or this is for the whole system, and by system I mean community, to be able to understand and meet the needs of the kids and the families as they present. Maybe that's a good time and space to move over to the risk factors that Denille was mentioning before.
I was just going to mention the fourth possible group, and then we could do that. I don't know what you think about this, but in light of the tremendous workforce shortage in rural, it does make me wonder about the role of a classroom teacher. And I know that classroom teachers feel they're already providing emotional support to their students, and I think that's one of the factors of their burden and their compassion fatigue. And at the same time, I do wonder, is that sort of, part of a realistic solution to address the fact that we are facing a massive shortage? I don't know what you all think about that.
I think that, I know that we have legislation that just passed that's going to create mental health standards, which seems to bring it more directly into the classroom. I think that one of the huge piece always goes back to teachers not having the resources that they need to understand what their kids need. And I think that then adds to their fatigue, right? Because it's so stressful to know that there's a kiddo who needs something and to then reach out and not have through nobody's fault other than circumstance, there's not really a place to plug them into for support.
Well, and I think, too, in the past few years, we have made tremendous progress towards providing our general ed teachers those kind of supports, that type of training. I was just thinking when we were talking about the social worker aspect, how much more connected we are into other resources that exist in our communities. And before we even started taping and talking about the village approach to this and why it takes everyone working together, that's really the only way we're going to be able to make some headway on this. But from my perspective and working with many schools and districts just over the past few years, the strides we've made in addressing a lot of these issues has just been really phenomenal. I think there are more partnerships, there are more organizations like yours that exist to help support everyone. And so I definitely think in light of the challenges that we've had some creative ways of addressing those and really started to tackle those. And we're seeing a lot more supports come about and really getting the educators the support that they need in order to help support the kids in their classrooms.
Yeah, I really agree. There's this convergence of a momentum that's being built among, state legislators, foundations, organizations like the Colorado Rural Education Collaborative.
And I would say potentially some of our listeners, right? Alex always reminds us to tap into how can the business community help. If this is a passion space for any of you, we absolutely 100% can help tap you into these programs. For the most part, cost money and take time, and we need subs in place, and there are places and spaces, so partnerships with outside organizations, private and or public, nonprofit or for-profit, are always welcome.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful investment, because if every student in Colorado graduates with social emotional skills and the ability to reflect and the ability to soothe, and has that strong resiliency, then that just makes for a stronger workforce. Okay, so you wanted to talk about the risk and protective factors.
Well, I think that's one of the things that always comes up when we're talking about rural issues. What are the unique challenges that rural school districts face? And I think that's just one of the additional layers that makes it a little bit more complicated to reach our rural communities. So I think if we talked a little bit about what are those additional risk factors, not only for kids, but for adults, and for as a barrier for people wanting to come in and work in that environment, and thinking about some of the solutions that we have and the work that we've done to try to address some of those things.
I'm going to need some help on this, the way that you framed it. It'd be good to hear from others on this one. One of the things that we're trying to do is get graduate students excited about living and working in rural Colorado as mental health professionals. And one of the challenges that we heard them articulate, or at least a couple of them articulate, is economic opportunity for their romantic partners. Lack of jobs, lack of housing. The housing, I think, is affordable, but there isn't much of it.
So I think it depends on where you are.
Yeah, and I'm actually really thinking about Southeast Colorado right now.
If you go west,
that's
right?
So
if
true.
we're in Roaring Fork or Summit,
and so that's one way to kind of address what you're talking about, just in terms of challenges to meeting the mental health needs, is creating incentives to attract people to move there and work there. I'm not sure if that's exactly where you wanted to go with that.
Well, I think looking at the risk factors, Elaine does a lot of presentations around this. If anybody is interested, reach out to her. Her information will be on the website. But some of the stuff that you shared of us around changing economy, loss of jobs, I mean, that's a huge dynamic for our rural communities. And part of our hope with this show is to figure out ways and promote ways where folks are scaling great work and rejuvenating, vibrant rural communities is our vision as well.
Yeah.
Because I know when we look at our economics across the state, one of the things that we find is that we actually have the lack of economic development in the rural affects our student population, and so we see that their association with free and reduced lunch per populace is actually higher in our rural than it is in our metro areas. And so I think a lot of people have that flipped in their heads, and so we know that that's one of the risk factors around behavioral health is living in poverty, and what does that look like? I also think things like lack of access to mental health services, lack of medical services, those kind of things are all factors that we know lead to some of the statistics you brought up earlier around why we have such a concern around behavioral health for rural Colorado kids. To do that, I know we have some other ones that we were looking at that have huge impacts with it, but we also know social media in this day and age has an impact for rural kids, that they it's amazing how we all have phones and that what that access looks like. Even for rural, there's broadband for most of our state, and they get access to that social media, which can have a negative impact.
We had a really cool opportunity in March to visit with some rural high school students in Southeast Colorado, and they were telling us what they thought the main benefits and challenges were for living in their community. And one of the challenges that they talked about was the lack of activity choices. So they have activities through their school, and they do a lot of sports, and they do 4-H, but they were telling us that wasn't enough, especially on the weekends. And I know that got identified in a study that was done in the central corridor of the state, like from Chaffee County up north, there was a really important study that just got done on why the suicide rates are so high in that part of the state, and they interviewed kids, and those kids mentioned what Kirk just said. What did you just say?
I think we were talking about social media.
Social media, right?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, and then they also mentioned the lack of extracurricular activities and options available.
Well, and I think we would see a trend probably nationwide. There was some data that was shared at the Prescription Drug Safety Network Summit that was held in Washington, D.C. Earlier in the month. And they were talking about the drastic decline in kids, even informally socializing as high school kids. And so in my mind, I'm wondering if there's a real correlation between the lack of resources and activities, or is it the decision to not formally socialize with their peers? And so I think that would be an interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting, so a lot of my stories are about very, very small school districts where sometimes the graduating class is 7 students. So I asked them, what do you do about your senior prom? And they talked about how they would never go to prom with somebody in their own class or date somebody in their own class because it's too much drama if it doesn't work out. So then there's a network where they find out about each other. I think oftentimes through sports, they find out about each other, and so they'll either merge districts for social occasions, or kids know how to, connect up that way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder what some of those contributing factors are then to even some of the risk factors we talked about with social media. So regionally, it would be interesting to see what those types of kids are engaged in and what opportunities they have outside of their classroom, outside of sports, to really look at what other opportunities we can provide for them.
One thing I want to say, just to kind of balance out the sort of negatives that we're talking about, is that what I found is that the adults in Southeast Colorado, at least, are so committed to creating social and meaningful experiences for the kids. It's almost as if they'll stop at nothing. They're so giving and devoted. And so I think and that makes me think about Michelle's point about, attracting businesses to think about, the role that they can play in that as well.
Right. We're going to the same place.
Yeah. Anyway, I just want to balance some of that negative with a beautiful asset that I just kept hearing over and over again, Absolutely. Which is the commitment of adults to make it a good experience for their kids.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we do see is that there is a huge positives in living in rural and the support. I think what we all talk about is that unfortunately, what we're seeing is the statistics continue to show us that this is a major risk and a major issue for our state and our communities in understanding what we can do to help support our kids. And I think it really is an economic driver, is how do we make sure that we have vibrant young youth who are ready to enter the workforce when their time that happens.
Right.
And so I think as we look at it, that's a big piece that we're all trying to tackle, is how do we make sure that youth is safe, that they feel like they belong, that they're part of a community, and that they're supported to do that. And ensuring that, I think, is really critical for our state in the future of both rural and metro parts of Colorado.
And we know through some of the grant work that Donnell K with a handful of our rural districts around the state, that grant structure was bringing different community partners together. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was enough to create the infrastructure through which they could do that, engage their kids, engage their families, and say, what do you need? Right? And I think the solutions, and maybe that's one of our next shows, right, is to talk about what some of that work looks like. But the solutions, a critical piece of this, are going to look different in every community. Right?
Well, and I think there's a couple takeaways from this first part of our discussion. So in our first episode, we talked about the really deep commitment and love that rural people have for their own communities. So I think there's definitely one huge opportunity there. And then just understanding how all of these other pieces connect. So it makes me think of a quote from one of our superintendents that serves on our Commissioners Rural Education Council, so Don Rangel from Weld County, and we were talking about just sometimes our negativity and getting bogged down by all of these challenges that we're facing. And he said, you look down the road and you see obstacles are opportunities, and it's our charge to see the opportunities versus the obstacles. So I think there's a lot there, and in our next segment, we'll get into that.
Wow, what a fascinating conversation, you guys. Thank you so much. We're going to take a quick break here on Connect and Collaborate. Be sure to like and subscribe our YouTube page while you're here, and we'll be right back. Stay with us. And welcome back to Connect and Collaborate. Once again, I'm Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and we are on episode 2 of Redefining Rural, again, sponsored by CSU Global. You can find every episode at cobrt.com/radio-podcast. Let's jump into segment 2 of this conversation.
Okay, so let's go back to our workforce shortage, and let's talk about some of the strategies that are in place to help some of our schools and districts fill those spaces and help them with building their own capacity.
Okay, so as I'm sure you know, the Colorado Department of Higher Education has really named the teacher workforce shortage as a big issue. And so they have a funding opportunity called Plan into Action. And Kirk and I are actually partnering on a project in, part of it is in Southeast Colorado, part of it's statewide. And what we're trying to do is create a robust school mental health workforce. And the way we have 3 strategies that we're implementing to try to both recruit and retain school mental health professionals. And by that, I mean, again, the school psychologists and school counselors primarily. So the first strategy is an immersion where what we did is we recruited graduate students who are getting degrees in school psychology and school counseling. And we recruited them to spend a week with us in southeastern Colorado visiting rural school districts. And the goal really was to get them excited about a life in rural Colorado. So we structured the week in a way where they got to speak with students and learn about all the pros of living in rural and some of the cons. They got to meet with existing school psychologists that are employed by the Board of Cooperative Extension Services, BOCES. And they got to also just experience some of the natural world. So they got to, go to these beautiful canyons and state parks and things like that, just to kind of start to imagine what life could look like. They even met with a realtor to learn about, how much does it cost to buy a house and what's out there in the market and things like that. We had 7 students join us for the week, and they were from Texas, Nebraska, and Colorado.
It was a full week?
It was a Sunday through a Friday.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a huge commitment.
We rented a big white van and drove, I forget if it was like 900 miles during that time because it's a huge area. And they had a fantastic time. And, of course, as you would expect, we gave them surveys at the end to answer so that we would learn if our program was working. And 6 of the 7 students said that they were much more likely to consider a career in rural. So we're going to try to kind of continue working with them to get them a placement in Southeast Colorado, and with the hope that, maybe they'll really plant some roots there.
Did all of them come from an urban setting?
No, a couple of them, some of them definitely came from urban, but a couple of them came from rural Texas, for example. And so I think it was an easier sell for the rural graduate students. But even the ones that weren't completely from a rural setting, I think got extremely excited. I was saying before we were taping that, it's really exciting to be in your 20s and to be able to imagine that you could purchase a home if there was a home available. I think there's a problem there with availability. But in Southeast Colorado, you as a young person, have a really good chance of being able to afford buying a home. Okay, so that's the first strategy.
Well, and I would say the immersion experiences are happening all over the state through different partnerships, and it's really an incredible opportunity. I think those of our listeners that are urban and suburban have no idea. First time I drove to Lamar or to Holyoke as a city girl, I was like, oh my goodness. And I'm sure first time I drove to Lafayette from Boulder, I felt the same way, right, 10 or 20 years ago. So giving those kids an opportunity to really engage, and the ones that get sparked, that's fantastic, because I think what we've heard from the folks in the field is they're a little worried about a fit.
Right.
These are sensitive positions, and what kind of people are going to come out and be accepted by our community if they're not one of us?
Well, and I think too, the whole question about what rural really is. I think there are a lot of different definitions and a lot of different ways that people think about what rural is. So a while back, we were meeting with a group of students that were in ed prep programs, and they were asking me, is this a rural district? Is this one a rural district? And so it was really interesting to know that as rural students themselves, they really didn't understand what rural would look like outside of their own their region or their zone. So I think one of the ways the immersion experiences have helped people understand is actually going out to the communities to see what that looks like. And Kirk touched on it in our last episode, just about the different types of rural communities that we have and how all of them are very unique. So I think that's one of the takeaways that people have when they finally go out to visit some of our areas.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'd say was kudos to our applicants who came and joined us. What was really exciting is some of them actually took their spring breaks to spend a week and learn about what it was like. And I think that's one of the things that we learned is that you really need to, it's more than a drive-by. Like, you can't just come by a school district and go, oh, this is what rural looks like. You got to get into that and be around and meet the people and do that. So we really applaud them in that. We also, their universities were great. Those who came from out of state actually did not have spring break at the time we had scheduled it. We intentionally did it during Colorado spring breaks. And so these folks who were coming from Texas and Nebraska, their professors actually allowed them to take the whole week off to see what this experience was like and to experience it. So we were really excited that the students were willing to invest in really learning what it was like. And I think our numbers really showed that not only were they interested, but the experience really enlightened a passion that they want to come back and do that. And so I think it's something, as Michelle said, that we've got other institutions in our state who are using the same sort of model. And as we try to increase the opportunity, this is the first one that really focused on the mental health side. So it was exciting because we know the shordage that we're seeing is so huge that we had to do something to try to get the numbers of applicants up. So we feel like this was a good piece. But you want to talk about the other parts?
Okay, so then there's another strategy that we have, and this one is more around retention, because we know that, and by retention, obviously, I mean keeping people in their current positions, right? And we know that one of the strategies to do that is to provide a lot of support. And sometimes I think what happens is when you get a job in a rural community and you're tucked away pretty far away from Denver, oftentimes it's kind of hard to tap into professional development opportunities. So we have the Morgridge College of Education just became an ECHO site, and I don't know if that's something you're familiar with, but Project ECHO is a evidence-based strategy to provide professional development to, it started in the medical field, and it was shown through, really high-quality studies to increase workforce capacity. So what we're trying to do with ECHO-DU is see if we can take that same model of professional development, which I can explain in just a moment, and see if we can bring it to the education arena and see if we can get that same set of outcomes of increased workforce capacity. So what we're doing is so let me just say, ECHO looks like this. It's a virtual professional learning community. And so people use Zoom, which probably you're familiar with. It's a video conferencing platform. And they come together from all parts of the state to learn about a topic together, and maybe even more importantly, to bring their most challenging cases to the group for problem solving.
That is such a big piece. I can't, to have a cadre of practice for those folks to be able to rely on is
well, and I think that
awesome.
addresses one of the challenges challenges that we face in our rural districts as far as capacity. There's not always training available for that small group of people. And even our BOCES, I think, are challenged with that. They have such a small population, and providing them with the relevant PD that they need is sometimes a struggle. So I think this is a great way to get people connected that are job-alike peers.
We're hearing a lot of excitement for ECHO. ECHO has a catchphrase, moving knowledge, not people. And when we try to recruit for this particular ECHO, what we want to do is bring school psychologists and school counselors from across rural Colorado together to learn about the latest best practices around, combating depression, suicide, harm, violence, bullying, school disengagement. So with very little effort to recruit, and Michelle and Kirk were helpful to recruiting, we had 100 people sign up. We were hoping for 20, and then realized, oh my gosh, we've got 100 people.
That's how you know you hit a need, right?
Exactly. So, what we decided to do, given the demand, is we're gonna launch it this fall and just have like 3 concurrent sessions so that hopefully everyone can participate. And then also, like when we mentioned this to our 27 rural district partners in Southeast and the San Luis Valley, that we might be able to use ECHO to provide professional development on some other health-related issues, you could just tell they just felt like this is going to be so helpful to them because they don't have to move. We just move the knowledge to them and then create that situation where they can bring their challenges to each other.
In fact, I heard from a superintendent recently that just the fact of the flyer that we sent out announcing ECHO got the mental health providers in the school districts in his area. They have their own little group going now. And talking to Elaine earlier, she had said our hope is they create these, without the facilitation, they have a place and a space where they can all hook up and discuss their practice situations.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's a great opportunity for them to connect, and I think they'll realize that they're a lot more the same than they are different. And so hopefully it's a way for them to discuss what solutions they might have and help solve some of those challenges.
Yeah, and not feel so alone,
Which is scary in that world when you're talking to kids who are in this incredible, what appears to be a crisis space, and you have no idea how to handle that. To be able to tap in is huge.
So the third and final strategy for this Plan into Action grant that Kirk and I are working on, we call it the workforce strategy. And so what we're doing is we're partnering. Well, let me back up. The Colorado Department of Higher Ed is really looking for universities to form long-standing partnerships with boards of cooperative extension. Am I saying that acronym
BOCES.
correctly? BOCES?
Yeah.
So that together we can try to address teacher shortages, and in our
just
case,
for our listeners, we talked about it last week. BOCES are groups of small rural districts and rural districts that come together for the purpose primarily of providing special education services required to students with disabilities, but also to address more of the broader needs of the general student populations.
Yeah, and it's sort of an economies of scale model, because when you have all these little rural districts, sometimes you have to share, resources like a school psychologist.
Correct.
So what we're doing with that one is trying to come up with a 5-year strategic plan to figure out how we can meet a rural community's hiring needs around school psych and school counseling. And so that's we're in the very early stages of what we're doing.
Correct me if I'm wrong, there's an opportunity for folks who want to get involved to help support that work, correct?
We would love that. We would love to have all kinds of community stakeholders and businesses,
I'm talking,
for example.
the listening community.
Absolutely.
I was involved in some of the ground floor planning of the work. It's incredibly exciting, but it's going to be a lift. And the idea of getting more local kids excited about these kinds of jobs so they can fill them within their own communities through engaging students and graduates of the University of Denver and other higher ed programs is, to me, a dream come true. So,
yeah, that would be excellent.
So I think talking about how embedded these issues are in the communities brings us to our next topic of conversation about how this fits into the overall umbrella of school preparedness. And I can just touch on some of the work that the department has done with the Commissioners Rural Education Council.
Can you talk about what school preparedness means?
Yeah, sure. So, and I think there are different definitions for everybody, and I think we're moving towards more commonly defined, some of the more common definitions so that we can all be on the same page. And I think we've identified that as a challenge, is that we all think of something different when we bring up some of these terms. But we did discuss a little bit about the Commissioners Rural Education Council in our last episode. So this is a council that is put together to advise the commissioner on rural challenges and opportunities. And so in the past year, one of the priorities that the council has determined is mental health, but the overall school preparedness challenge. So looking at the overall umbrella of school preparedness, we're talking about health and wellness, emergency crisis planning, and also safety and security and personnel, and how all of these different pieces overlap and we can leverage some of the work that's being done. So back in October, we met up in the West Grand School District. We brought together about 9 different agencies, including Elaine, to talk about what is happening throughout the state regarding all of these different issues. And so we were really able to identify the resources that exist, but also a lot of the work that's being done. And I think some of the takeaways from those superintendents and others on the council was that there is a lot of work being done in a lot of these areas. And one of the main challenges with that they see is just getting the word out to the schools and districts about how they can tap into some of those resources. And I think it's a little complicated just because safety and security does not live within the Colorado Department of Education. So the Colorado School Safety Resource Center is the one charged with providing a lot of the communication and the resources. And so we try to work as closely as possible as we can with them. And in fact, Chris Harms and I head up a committee that engages a lot of different agencies to talk about these kinds of issues. But
And
really,
Chris Harms is the executive director
Yes.
of the Resource Center.
and so we just really were able to lay out a lot of those resources around mental health, bullying prevention, resources for at-risk students, counselors, school climate safety, and how these can all fit together, as well as what that security personnel can help us with. And so it's an ongoing conversation. We're having another meeting up in July in Breckenridge to dig a little bit deeper into the mental health aspect of this. But I think it's just important for us to keep reiterating the fact that all of these different pieces are connected. And if we're going to address safety and security and hardening our targets and all of those things, we also have to address it on the other side and put in all of these preventative measures in place as well. So I think there's a ton of work being done. And thank you to all of you guys for being a part of that. But we're going to continue to collaborate and keep strategizing about how we can actually bring a lot of these resources out to our rural districts.
I think a lot of what we hear from our folks, and I think that was a rural council conversation, right, was we need to know what we need to know and what are the steps in emergency preparedness? What does that process look like? And I know that's something that Denille and Chris have been working on getting more information out to our folks on. Kirk, did you want to talk a bit about some of the work that the collaborative is doing?
Sure. I think we brought it up earlier in the segment is this, when we look at schools, who are the folks who really can interface with kids? And one of the biggest ones every day is really our teachers. And so as we look at behavioral health challenges, one of the things that we're trying to continue to do is leverage how do we use those folks who are working with kids on a daily basis. And so currently through some support of some private foundations, we're doing some work with 15 school districts around social emotional learning and how to support the mental health of kids. And the way that this actually pilot with these 15 districts looks is we do what we call distributive guidance. And so what we're in the process of training teachers to actually help students better understand their own emotional health, how to deal with struggles that are going on in their lives, and then how to access than when they're struggling with it. And so part of that is really to create an environment within their classroom, and we call it advocacy because we believe that the teacher is really becomes an advocate. The kid becomes an advocate for themselves through this process. And so one of the goals is to really look at how do we provide an environment within our schools that they can talk about situations, events that happen in their own lives in a safe space. And so they do that through shared conversations. They also do it around direct instruction around those areas to help support the kids. And then the teachers who are in those classrooms help supporting it. You know, when we look at our systems, even when they have a counselor, it's very difficult for a counselor to get out to all the children within the building. But by helping train teachers to be that first line, it allows then kids to have a safe place, and then the teachers can become advocates if they can identify and then someone who is at a greater risk for issues that are going on. And so we've had some really outstanding results in our first year of scaling this. We started with 5 original districts, have now moved that to 15, and so the results we got back from the kids were really exciting. Things like 85% of them students came back and said, I now have a safe place to talk about my concerns. I feel like I learned, I think it's 80% of the students who participate said, I learned skills that are going to help me in work and life. And so we're really excited about the results that we've seen. We have some more studies that we're doing in some research-based components with that we'll know later in the next school year when we get the analysis done. But I think it's really this opportunity to say, how do we help in small schools really distribute that support for kids to everyone who touches kids going on, and that all students have a safe place. Because I think when we talked about the risk factors, one of the things that we see is that families are an incredible support structure, grandparents, aunts and uncles, but when kids don't have that, the question is, who do they go to? And so I think one of the things that our advocacy program that we're working on with these districts does is it provides the adult within the classroom as a place to go to and be able to talk and do that. And it provides the teachers with skills and curriculum or being able to do that. Because as we know, most educators, when they take their methods classes, this isn't an area that our higher ed institutions spend a great deal of time helping support new teachers coming into the field. And so it's an area that we've looked to try to boost and help support. It is a great going back to where people could dive in and support. Unfortunately, the foundations that have supported us getting this off the ground continue to support us, but we are continuing to look for more funds to be able to scale this to other districts. And so definitely...
Is it a K-12 curriculum? Sorry.
It is. We partner with another curriculum called Random Acts of Kindness, which does the elementary function, and then we have another, the other one that we work with is then 6 through 12. So we have 2 separate curriculums. The model is the same regardless if you're kindergarten classroom in 12th grade, which is really fun to go in and see when you see kids engaging in common dialogue regardless of what grades about things that they're struggling with. You know, a big part of the curriculum on both the elementary and the high school is about creating a safe space to have those dialogues, and what does confidentiality look like, so that kids feel that there's a place that they can go to share, an adult that they can share. And as we said, one of the things that we do is then provide support for teachers to then work within their own systems if red flag events come up during those sharing cycles and those kind of things, to get them to more intensive people who can then really support at that level. We don't expect a teacher by any means to psychoanalyze a child. We just need them to recognize that this is outside the norm or curve for students, and then help them get help. If it's within our schools, within our community, that's part of what this social emotional learning and the advocacy program that we're working with does. So it's really exciting, a way to help intervene for kids in rural areas when we're looking at a workplace shortage and not having the resources or the people to do that, is tapping into those who touch kids every day, and those are our classroom teachers, and it's providing them those skills to be able to do that. So it's a very exciting project that we're working on. Like I said, we're seeing great results, and it's definitely an area, if listeners are interested in wanting to engage in this issue, we're always looking for foundations, private and business, to see how we can move this into more schools across our state that see the need.
I am so excited to hear about it at 2 levels. One is just knowing that there's one more place a child who's suffering can go to is so important. I was at a conference last week, and there was this excellent presentation led by young people, and they were a group of LGBTQ people. They were trying to help us understand what happens when you come out. And what they taught us is that when you take the risk of coming out, you might lose several support systems, your family, your church, not necessarily, but you might. And so knowing that a classroom becomes an added place where you can go to is wonderful. And just very quickly, I'd love to know if the teachers are feeling like their own social emotional health is improving.
Yes, and I think what we continue to see is how does that spread out amongst the staff that are working at it. I think anytime we can provide them skills that help them deal with what they're dealing with day to day and their students, they feel better about what's going on.
Yeah, it's
and
excellent.
so I know it's part of our research that we're looking into
Yeah.
is some of those questions.
This has been super exciting. We are so glad to have you here. This is not our last conversation about mental health in any way, shape, or form. I know we were hoping Denille would have some time to share some of the department's resources and some of the grants and some of the great legislation that we did see from the State House bringing more money to this issue. But stay tuned. We'll talk more about that.
Thank you all so much again for joining me on Connect and Collaborate. It has been a real pleasure, and all of the things that we discussed here today can be found in the link in the description below, so be sure to click on that. And again, find Redefining Rural, sponsored by CSU Global, at cobrt.com/radio-podcast. Have a wonderful day, you guys.
Thank you.